Hello everybody, and today I wanted to talk about the US Cruiser grind. Now, I'm almost all the way through it. I've gotten up to the Brooklyn, and what you're seeing in the background is actually my first game in the Brooklyn. And of course I hadn't played in a little bit, so my aim was a little bit off in that game, but still. I overall wanted to talk about not the light cruiser side of the line, but the heavy cruisers and also the Omahas, because it seems like it's such a slog for such a nice start of a line. When you started out the American line, you had these really peppy destroyers that could basically absolutely destroy everything in front of them. There wasn't an enemy that you really had to be scared of, short of bigger ships. And you could really tear apart most things, even some light cruisers. And then you get to the Trenton. And the guns slow down, they're not as good, it's very easy to penetrate, pretty much everything else shreds you. So once you're done with that, you're like, alright, I'm gonna get a really good upgrade here, and it's another Omaha, and all they did was add some very mediocre secondaries to it, and it's not fun. I mean, it's kind of something you saw in the Japanese line a little bit with the Kuma and the Sendai, but even to that extent, those things had usable torpedoes, whereas the Rayleigh and Trenton really don't. But, you know, you gotta get through them. They're very early cruisers. So what's your reward? Well, you get to the heavy cruisers of the American line. Not counting the Atlanta, that's a light cruiser, that thing's a monster, as I've said before. But the heavy cruisers, the Portland, the Northampton, the Pensacola, the New Orleans, and the Pittsburgh specifically, are pretty painful to grind through, actually. And some of this might be me being used to the Japanese diving shells where they have really good penetration and you're basically just aiming for underwater magazines to detonate ships and always tearing them apart. But starting with the Portland and going through these heavy cruisers, your guns don't get any better. You don't change what gun you're using, your ammo doesn't get any better, your fire rates don't get any better. The only thing that really changes is your anti-aircraft armament and your secondaries when you get to Pittsburgh. I'd say Pittsburgh is probably the best out of all of them due to the secondaries being fairly useful, whereas the rest, it's very ineffective secondary batteries. And on top of that, the other painful part with having guns that are very mediocre, not wanting to penetrate stuff, very floaty shells in some cases, and a substantial reload for the downsides of these ships, is you have very weak armor. Basically anything with an armor piercing round, including destroyers, will penetrate your armor and can hit your magazines, and in some cases all it needs is a little bit of HE and you're done. These things are very weak. They do not take hits well. They can be fairly maneuverable and fast, but not as fast as the Japanese cruisers. And most ships don't struggle to hit them too bad. And especially when you're grinding them early, you don't have that maneuverability that you do when you have all the essential modifications such as engine upgrades and rudders and such. So it's really a slog to get these things ground out and get to the next ship. And my biggest problem with them is there's no reward to it. Like, alright, when you're done with the Atlanta, you can grind to the Fargo if you wanted to. That thing is also a monster. And even though, like, in the background you see my high explosive shells on the Brooklyn aren't doing a ton, but once you get the upgraded high explosive shells on these ships with the base fuse, they are insane. They are very good ships. But my problem with the heavy cruisers is you have 4 mediocre ships to grind through to get to Pittsburgh, which the only real upgrade there is the secondary batteries. So you're using the same shell all the way through with the same main batteries, and you don't even get a Des Moines at the end of the grind, which I think is a big fault that I'll place on War Thunder. They have 2 Des Moines class cruisers in this game already. One's a premium and one's an event ship as far as I'm aware. There's no Tech Tree Des Moines class cruiser. It would be a perfect addition right after the Pittsburgh, even if they made it a 6.3 or something and gave it a little bit more stats than the premium Des Moines class cruiser, if that's even possible. But there's no reward at the end of the heavy cruiser line. When you're done with the light cruisers, there's Fargo, there's Brooklyn, there's Cleveland that all use the same guns and the same shells, and then there's Roanoke, which absolutely destroys matches from what I've seen. And that thing is a monster if it doesn't get focused down. So that's really my problem with the US line, is they start off really strong so far, and then it kind of peters out because you gotta slog through these cruisers that are just very mediocre. They can't really fight anything on their own, which, alright, they're made to be fleet cruisers, but still, they can't take a hit in return. It just is very, very painful for a player to grind through. And while early on I said yes, the US line is probably the best starter line in the game, I almost want to take that back and say for the destroyers, because you can learn a lot from the destroyers, but you get to the cruisers and you don't get a lot of gimmies where the shells aren't going to detonate you or absolutely wreck you to learn from your mistakes. You basically have to learn from getting detonated that, hey, you got to pay attention to everybody watching, or anybody turning their guns towards you, or shells flying towards you, or shells flying towards the ship next to you. So really, between that, the gun's not getting any better for you through the whole entire grind, and the floatiness of the shells not helping with your aim that much, makes it really hard for me to recommend the heavy cruiser line, or the heavy cruiser grind for the US line. Especially when, like I said, there's no reward at the end of it. Now, maybe it changes and the battleships start to get really good. Like I said, I haven't gotten to them yet. I'm literally just grinding my first modules on the Brooklyn. But I kind of wanted to get this out there and say a couple things about the grind that I've been through, because other than the fact that these things swat aircraft out of the sky left and right, and that is of its own regard very, very impressive, I don't have a lot of good things to say about the heavy cruisers. I believe that'll be reflected when I do the total US line review, as I think a lot of these will be getting low scores. Pittsburgh will probably get a few extra points for the good secondaries, obviously. But I really take issue with there's no Tech Tree Des Moines to reward players when they slog through all these heavy cruisers. They just get kicked back to, you know, the early battleships. So I think War Thunder could do a little bit better with this. Either try to folder some of these ships and stick a Des Moines in there, or do something to reward the US cruiser players somehow, because the Portland, the Northampton, Pensacola, and New Orleans are absolute slogs to get through because everybody knows that you're a soft target. And the Trenton and the Rayleigh are just the same thing twice. You get no real upgrades or benefits over each other. So I don't see why those two can't really be foldered. Anyway guys, I know this was a short one and a bit rambly. I'm hoping to get some different content out pretty soon. There's a couple ideas I want to try. But I just wanted to discuss this topic really quick and complain that there's no Tech Tree Des Moines, which I'm pretty disappointed with. Hope your matches are going well, and good luck out there. I'll see you next time.